Hey folks, so Hegemony is already a pretty big game, as is evident by the runtime of my tutorial, and I'm known for brevity. But if you want to add on even more, there are a couple of expansions. These being Historical Events, which is just a little baby expansion with one cool module, and Crisis and Control, which adds a few additional modules and cards, but the biggest thing it provides is a system for adding automated players to your game, allowing you to fill out any of the 3 social classes and even play the game solo. We're going to start small and work our way up, so let's begin with Historical Events. This tiny little box adds a deck of cards that are based on real historical events, hence the name, and will shake up the game in a number of different ways. You'll separate the cards into their 6 eras, randomly pull one from each, and create a face-down deck with the round 5 card at the bottom. The first card will apply during setup, so apply the changes before starting the game. From then on, every round, right before you start the action phase, including on the first round, draw the next card from the deck. These cards will always have a trigger and an effect, and will usually have a requirement as well. Often the trigger will happen at a predetermined time if the requirement is met, but other times it will provide a free or basic action to a player or players. On their turn, if the requirement is met, they can take that action. Regardless of how the trigger occurs, you then follow the instructions on the effect. On the next round, you'll draw a new card and cover up the old one. The effects are mostly self-explanatory, but there are a few things that need a little bit of clarification. First off, if you see something that mentions the state but doesn't show the state player icon, it will trigger whether you have a state player or not. However, if it does show a state player icon, that part of the effect will only happen in a 4-player game. Speaking of player counts, this symbol refers to the player count of your game and will have adaptable values based on that. So for this card, a 2-player game requires 2 luxury companies, but a 3 or 4-player game needs 3. If a bill has been proposed and an effect moves the policy marker, that bill is returned and the player who proposed it gains an influence. And lastly, if an effect states that there will be no elections, you can't propose any bills during the round and the elections phase is completely skipped. If bills had already been proposed, they are discarded and the players who proposed them gain an influence for each. And that's all for historical events. Like I said, it's nice and easy. So let's kick things up a notch with Crisis and Control. Alright, so Crisis and Control is a much more substantial expansion, and it comes with 2 main things. There's the modules and extra cards, and then there's the Automa that let you play a solo game or fill in missing classes. Let's start with the modules, or mini expansions as they call them in the manual. First off, we've got some extra cards for each player's action deck. These are easy to use and highly interactive. Just shuffle them in before playing, and there you go. Next up, we've got hidden agendas. This adds secret objectives for each player. At the beginning of the game, you'll draw 2 cards and keep one of them. Some of these are endgame bonuses, but not all. If you've accomplished the task it sets out for you in the timing window provided, reveal the card and gain the reward. The only caveat here is that if a card can be completed at any time, you can't claim it in the middle of an elections phase. You gotta wait for all the elections to finish. Okay, so those 2 were dead simple. The next 2 are a little bit meatier. Alternate Events gives you a new deck of event cards that replaces the old one. These events work much like the original ones, except that after completing an event, you'll give the card to the class you chose. That player can either place the card in front of them for an ongoing benefit, shown on the bottom of the card, that will last the rest of the game, or they can discard it and gain a point. And you can't hold on to it now and discard it later. Once you've made a choice, you're locked in. And lastly, we have Crisis Response, which changes how IMF intervention works. During setup, you'll shuffle this Crisis Response deck and keep it near the main board, revealing the top card. Instead of having a set IMF procedure that is always the same, this card will determine how the IMF intervenes, which will shake things up, especially in where it sets the policies, and will also have some additional effects shown in the center. Then after the intervention is complete, you'll draw a new card to replace the one you've just used. And there are 2 more potential effects. First off, we've got locked policies. Some cards will lock down a policy for the next round, meaning that no one can propose a bill on that policy. At the next check IMF step, you'll discard all lock tokens and the policies will be up for debate once more. And finally, there are bond cards. One of the Crisis Response cards allows the players to buy bonds from the state. When you do so, pay the state $30 or $50 and take a bond card as a reminder that they owe you some cash. When the state pays you back, you'll get the larger amount shown on the card. And that's all for the mini expansions, but the Automa are a pretty big addition, so let's learn how they work next. So you want to play this game solo, or you just want to fill an empty seat or two, or three. Either way, the Automa's got you covered. There are 3 Automas that cover the 3 social classes in both a simple and advanced mode. I'll cover the differences between those 2 modes first, then talk about general rules that both will follow, and finish with anything that's unique to the 3 different Automas. So, whether playing with simple or advanced, this automated player will follow almost all the same rules that you do, and can even win the game. On its turn, it will draw an AI card from this shuffled deck and take an action based on the symbols at the top. These symbols represent the basic actions, and these action criteria cards will tell you what they refer to. For the simple mode, it'll take the first possible action going from left to right, and if it takes the leftmost action, it'll gain a bonus shown in the center. This will sometimes change whether or not the action itself is possible, so keep that in mind when determining what the Automa does. And whether an action is possible is partly due to simple facts like it needs to be able to afford the action, but the criteria cards will list other prerequisites as well. Now, if none of the listed actions are possible, it'll take the special action at the bottom. And in the rare case that it can't even do the special, it will apply political pressure and add 3 voting cubes to the bag. Also, some cards will show a special action icon, and if this is the case, instead of a bonus being listed in the center, it will have some additional conditions. When playing simple mode, if the first condition is met, you take the special action. If it isn't, you move on, and we can ignore the other stuff for now. So we'll talk about how the Automa takes its actions soon, but the main difference between simple and advanced mode is how it chooses its actions. So let's cover the advanced mode next. This uses a ranked priority system, which will be adjusted every turn based on the board state and which actions it's considering. Each faction has a different setup, and you'll place cards representing actions on the left and policies on the right, with a line of priority row markers in the center, and some policies off to the side. Whenever the Automa draws an AI card, you'll use these check cards to raise or lower the priority of the actions and policies shown on the card. Taking each action in the AI card's order, you'll follow the instructions on the check card top to bottom. So for an easy example, this card has come up and we'll need to make these 4 checks, starting with the foreign market. As it says, we check the current export card to see if the Automa can sell. If it can make at least 2 transactions, you'll raise the Sell to Foreign Market or SFM card up 1 space per transaction it can make. Let's say it could make 4, so we move up 4 spaces and slide in the Proposed Bill card. If the Automa couldn't make any transactions, we would have bumped up the Special Action card 1 space. And speaking of special actions, some cards will have checks for special actions written on them, so take these into account as well. Now, checking policies works the same way, but it can also raise the 2 policy cards up as well, unless it's not on the chart at all. Whenever raising or lowering any card, if it hits the same row as another card, place it farther away from the center, which is important because being closer to the center is a tiebreaker for priority. Now, once you've checked all the listed actions, collapse all empty rows on each side, and then the highest priority action will trigger if it's possible. If not, you go to the next highest priority action. And again, if none of the actions are possible, you apply political pressure. However, if you did perform any of these actions, you then drop it down 2 spaces, or to the bottom row if it was on the second space. And the last thing to talk about before we cover the actions themselves is proposing bills. When an Automa does this in advanced mode, it proposes the highest priority policy. Whenever a bill is proposed by any player, the policy gets set aside until the end of the round. During the next prep phase, you'll check all policies in numerical order. Each one that matches the Automa's desired policy is set aside. If they're 1 space away, they'll go on the bottom row, and if they're 2 spaces away, they'll go to the second row. Again, always placing on the outsidemost space. Also, if a bill is proposed and immediately voted on, it will be adjusted in the same way that we just saw. Okay, so let's take some actions. Like I said, this will largely occur in the same way regardless of playing simple or advanced, and I'll note when it's different. Whenever you perform a basic action that has more than 1 possible outcome, there will be a card to consult to determine the Automa's choice. These will have a list of criteria, which will help you narrow down your options. Start by finding the first bullet point that yields any results. Then, if you need to narrow it down further, keep going down and applying more criteria, ignoring any that only suggest choices not covered by your primary option. So for example, the capitalist AI needs to assign workers. A more dystopian sentence I've not said in a long time, but let's keep going. Following this card, our first criterion is that we don't have any other operational companies in that industry. All of these open companies are already covered, so we skip that one. Next, we want to fill companies that don't cause the requirements for a trade union to be met. With 2 more media workers, a purple union could be formed, so that knocks out this lobbying firm. There are already enough food workers for a green union, so that criteria doesn't apply to the fish farm. The next bullet point says media, but we've already eliminated our media company, so we fill the healthcare company next. There will be a card for basically any possibility, but if you run into something that can't be determined this way, use your best judgment to determine what would be most beneficial for the Automa. Next up, we've got elections, and let's first cover immediate voting. If you're playing a 2-player game and the Automa has at least 2 more influence than you, as well as more voting cubes in the bag, it'll spend 1 influence and make an immediate vote after proposing a bill. If it's a 3 or 4-player game, it'll first try to determine what side everyone is on based on where it thinks other players will vote. And there's a card that tells you what it expects from each player. After putting everyone into a perceived side, if the Automa's side has at least 2 more influence than its opposition, and at least one of the other 2 social classes is on its side, then it'll spend an influence and call for that immediate vote. Now, when the election occurs, it might spend influence based on the results of the initial vote poll. The Automa will either be on the winning side, the losing side and the only one with influence, or the losing side and its allies also have influence. Each of these camps comes with a card, and you can follow the little matrix to determine whether or not it will spend any influence. If it does, you'll often be asked to draw a number of cards, meaning you'll draw from the AI deck and check to see if there is an influence icon on the bottom left, adding 1 influence for each, or in this scenario, all the influence it has. Then place all drawn cards on the bottom of the deck, not the discard pile. And if you need to draw cards to add influence for the Automa, do so after the human players have committed their influence. Now, there are a few more quick things to mention before covering each class. First off, Automa players do free actions a little differently. They'll trigger in specific ways at specific times, and they aren't limited to 1 per turn, so they could trigger a bunch of them. Second, a few things are different on the 5th round of the game. Automa won't propose any bills for immigration, so you can completely ignore that policy for them. They'll only propose a bill for foreign trade if they can call for an immediate vote on it. During elections, there will only be 5 cards left in the AI deck, so shuffle the discard pile and place it on the bottom in case it needs to draw for influence. And during the last vote of the game, it will always spend all of its influence. So, with all that in mind, let's look at each of the 3 classes. They'll all have a specific setup for their priority cards, and as I mentioned, they'll take free actions in a specific way. And right off the bat, I'll say that I wish there was a player aid for those free actions, but as far as I can tell, there isn't. Or at least not an official one, so you might want to keep the rulebook handy. Anyway, for the working class Automa, whenever it has enough healthcare, education, or luxuries to increase prosperity, it'll use those resources at the end of its turn to do so. And if it can do this more than once, it'll do luxuries first, then education, then health. The Automa will swap workers immediately before taking the assign workers action if you're playing simple mode, or when checking workers in advanced mode. It will always receive benefits at the start of its turn if there are any, and lastly, it will always pay off a loan at the start of its turn if it's able to do so. Now, there are a few clarifications that are listed for all of the classes, but I'm going to skip them because they get pretty specific, and I don't think you really need to have these memorized for your first game. Just know that they exist and check them out when applicable. So for the capitalists next, they've got quite a few free actions, but these will sometimes be ignored. First off, there's adjust prices, which will happen at the start of the turn. The preference is to have prices in the middle. However, if the foreign trade policy is at A, it'll raise its food and luxury prices to the highest level. And likewise, if the healthcare or education policies are at C, it'll raise prices on health and education respectively. Next, it will adjust wages, always taking the lowest possible option, unless the working class places a strike token on one of its companies, in which case you'll follow the response to strike card on its next turn. The Automa will buy storage whenever it gains more resources than it can store, even if this happens outside of its turn. Of course, it can't have more than 1 storage of each type, and it will put any excess food and luxuries in the free trade zone first. Only if they're both full will it buy more storage for one of those. As with the working class Automa, it'll automatically receive benefits and pay off loans at the start of its turn if applicable. And lastly, the Automa will never give bonuses, because AI is not your friend. Lastly, we've got the middle class bots, which will increase its prosperity and swap workers the same as the working class, and adjust prices the same as the capitalist class. It'll always keep wages as low as possible, but if the working class calls a strike on a middle class company, it'll adjust wages to L3 on its next turn. Of course, at the beginning of the next round, it'll be dropping those wages back down to the minimum. And just like the others, it'll receive benefits and pay off loans at the start of the turn. And that's all you need to know to play with the Automa and all of the other expansion modules for Hegemony. Now, there are a few clarifications for how to mix the Automas and expansions, but they're easy enough to figure out that I didn't want to mention them here. Anyway, that's going to be it for me, folks, but did you know that my Patreon backers got to see this video a month before anybody else? If that's something that interests you, or if you want to tell me what games I should teach next, consider heading on over to the Patreon and pledging a buck or two. Either way, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!